Before we start the regular part of our program, I want to make a few comments and tributes to our late president, W. Allen Wallace, who I had the fortune to know for many, many years. In fact, it was 14 years ago today that W. Allen Wallace died at Strong Hospital. He had traveled to Rochester from Washington, D.C. to speak at a memorial service for Bill Meckling, who many of you know. He was the former dean of the Graduate School of Management, which now is the Simon School. In 24 days, we'll commemorate the 100th anniversary of the birth of W. Allen Wallace, ironically the day before the election. In the program, there is a short biography of Allen Wallace, which gives some of his accomplishments, but there were many more that could not fit into a one-page biography. But in the limited time that's available today, I would like to touch on some of these accomplishments as they're particularly related to the University of Rochester and to the Simon School in particular. Now, Allen was a well-known statistician and free market economist. Allen also made his mark as an academic administrator and as an advisor to presidents. Coming of age during the Great Depression and World War II, Allen's career did not follow the conventional academic pattern. He had periods of government service, he taught at several universities. Somehow he never managed to get around to getting his own PhD completed. But after World War II, he joined the faculty at the Graduate School of Business at the University of Chicago, and in 1956, he was appointed the dean of the Chicago School of Business. He and a colleague formulated what was referred to as the Chicago approach to business education, radical at that time, but now the standard mode. In 1962, he became president and then later chancellor at the University of Rochester until he left here in 1975. During his tenure at the university, the annual budget rose from $33 million to $200 million. Admittedly, there was some inflation during that period as well. But interesting, he also grew the faculty by 37%. The number of graduate students doubled during his period. And the Wall Street Journal wrote that Allen Wallace guided the transition of the University of Rochester from a largely provincial institution to a major national university. Now, as a former business school dean, Allen was particularly instrumental in shaping our business school using that Chicago approach. Our school had just separated from the economics department a few years before his arrival, and so we had very few permanent faculty members at the time. Allen hired Bill Meckling to lead the school and to grow it both in size of faculty and students, but also in reputation. At that time, in the early 60s, many business schools were more like training schools. But Rochester would develop a school with a high academic standards, very much in the Chicago tradition. In our early years, we quickly became known as a business school that was built on a foundation of economics and which took academics seriously, including establishing a PhD program, which ironically trained our competitors, but competing institutions. Another unusual feature of the business school at this time was the involvement in the analysis of public policy issues. Allen and Bill created the Center for the Research in Government Policy and Business and hired Carl Brunner, a very well-known monetary economist, to lead that center. Under Carl's leadership, the center studied a wide range of public policies, and one lasting legacy of Carl's period is the semi-annual Carnegie-Rochester Public Policy Conference, which has now met for close to 80 times. In the late 1960s, Allen Wallace and Milton Friedman were appointed members of a commission established by President Nixon to study the feasibility of eliminating the military draft. This was the Vietnam era, and that commission could have just become a debating ground for the merits or the lack of merits of the war. Instead, the commission established a study team headed by our dean, Bill Meckling, and the individuals involved that were in charge of the two major parts of that study were both Rochester faculty, the late Harry Gilman and Walter Oy. As a graduate student at Chicago, I was fortunate to have been a consultant to that commission, and the analysis of the report of this commission is widely viewed as being the critical point that eliminated the military draft, that convinced Congress to eliminate the military draft. So Rochester, through the influence of Alan Wallace, has had a major impact on American society even yet today. Ron Schmidt, who joined the Rochester Business School faculty the same year I did, will soon present his analysis of another issue around which there are very strong positions, but very oftentimes not supported by facts or analysis. His study is another example among many of the research that, using the analytical framework that the Simon School has become well known for since its inception. For this analytical focus, we owe a large debt to Alan Wallace, and we pay tribute to him today. Thank you.
Thanks, Ron, and for providing that link personally and as a testimonial to Alan Wallace's impact at the University of Rochester and the Simon School. We're hoping at one point to convince Ron to write a history of the Simon School because he's been with us for 3.5 decades plus and has done an enormous amount of good for our school. Another faculty member who's had a similar impact, have the pleasure of introducing as our speaker today. There's always a debate among business schools, do we serve a screening function or an educational function, or both? And there's a colleague, a former dean at Stanford's Business School, who wrote a Nobel Prize-winning paper basically arguing in a world of imperfect information, and if you're trying to show that you're a type A person, more productive than a type B person, you may find it useful to make unproductive investments to signal that you're a type A person. And one of the applications of this research paper has been to education and business schools in particular, that people may end up pursuing an MBA, even if it has no value, just to get a better job, to get screened into the right club. This colleague at Stanford has a fellow professor there, Jeff Pfeffer, who has taken that to the extreme and said if you get into a top-tier school like Stanford or Simon, you should just take your acceptance letter and not go. And go to the employer that you want to work for, because business schools served the screening function it's designed to produce. There's no school I'm aware of that prides itself on its educational mission, what happens while students are with us, as much as the Simon School does. And we consider it even more important than the screening function. And I think it's no small reason why Business Week in its most recent ranking placed us first among private schools in terms of ROI. The faculty member who I'd argue believes that the most is Ron Schmidt, the Joe and Janice Willett professor, who we've been delighted to have with us for well over 3 decades. When we ask our alums, what did you get out of Simon? The single most common response is, it taught me how to think. Other schools, their alums will say, I joined the club, I joined the network, and those are important, but it's very distinctive at Simon and something we pride ourselves on, teaching people how to think. And then when we scratch the surface with the alums, well, which faculty member most taught you how to think? Hands down, it's Ron Schmidt. And he continues that to this day. We'll attest to it every year. I have a couple students in my office who he's taught how to think too hard. Worried about, and he's very gracious with his time. If I'm working on an op-ed or a paper, he'll, every time I send him something, I've yet to get back a response saying that was a really great draft op-ed or really great paper or great idea, but can attest each time he's taught me how to think and improve the quality of my own work. We're very lucky to have him on our faculty. He's chosen a provocative topic to cover today. It's very much in the news, and we'll look forward to hearing his remarks and observations. Ron.
Well, let me tell you how I ended up thinking about economic inequality. I give a talk, I teach a course on organizations, and in this course, I always give one lecture on executive compensation. And that's because a good deal of the course is about compensation. And as you design a course or you teach it over time, you always ask, should I keep teaching that? Why do I do this? And as I approached executive compensation, I came to the conclusion I couldn't understand why it got so much public attention. I mean, think about it. Shareholders in publicly traded companies are not a group we'd classify as the vulnerable and in need of protection. They're successful, they can take care of themselves, and furthermore, if they're unhappy about what goes on inside a corporation, there's a simple thing they can do to change things: sell the stock. Furthermore, I couldn't understand all the talk about efficient compensation for CEOs. You know, if you're sitting in a room looking at a list of candidates to be CEO and someone says, well, listen, this person's really good, but if we don't get the incentives right, we're in trouble. Hopefully someone will say, do we have other names on the list? So I can't understand why it got the public attention. And finally, I came to the conclusion that really what's the reason executive compensation is getting a lot of attention is because we have this issue of economic inequality that is getting bandied about in the popular press, and certainly it surfaces and gets lots of attention in an election year. And I decided if my lecture on executive compensation was to be meaningful, I really ought to talk to the students a little bit about economic inequality and to look at those numbers carefully. So I went and started looking, and what I found was really very interesting. I found that the public statements don't match the data. And I'm going to relate to you today what I discovered, and I'm going to tell you up front that I'm going to give you 3 messages. And if you can't see the screen, there are a number of charts. If you can't see the screen, you have a hard copy. I have 3 messages for you that I want you to take away. First, I'm going to argue that the claims of a massive or even a significant increase in economic inequality don't fit the evidence. The people who are making those statements should get their dictionary and look at the definition of massive, look at the definition of significant, and in particular, look at the definition of increase. And I'll start with some data to support that. You'll have lots of questions about that data. In fact, I'll anticipate them. And those questions can't be answered until we look at a second issue. Because the problem we have here is that there are significant measurement issues that are rarely addressed that we have to look at when we start measuring economic inequality. The unit we use to measure, whether it's a household or a tax return, changes over time. Its characteristics change. From 1967 to 2011, mean household size in the U.S. fell from 3.3 members to 2.6. Now, when you start looking at a time series over a long period of time for households, and the household changes in size, you can draw the wrong conclusions about trends unless you make the necessary adjustments. The concept of income. Not all surveys cover all income. Sometimes Social Security is left out. And tax laws cause income that might have been corporate income to be classified as personal income. Those things can distort the measures as well. Finally, there is no good measure of economic inequality. If you want to lose weight, what do? You get on the scale regularly and see which way the number's moving. It's telling you, it's giving you useful information. We don't have a measure of inequality that does the same thing. I won't go into that exhaustively, and I realize in this second point, the topics here can be eye-glazing. You know, you start talking about this, well, I can see you already drooping eyelids. I have to deal with the second, though, so you understand how I approach the first. If I don't do that, you would have all sorts of questions about the first. So I'll talk a little bit about evidence supporting the first, deal with the second, come back to the first, and then I'll get to the third. And I'm going to suggest to you that the public debate about economic inequality has not been framed correctly. We spend too much time talking about trends, and we don't ask the question, well, why does it exist? Because the answers to those questions will lead to more sensible public policy than questions about how big it is. So I'll talk about that at the end. All right, how about some evidence here? All right, there's a chart for you. Now, what this chart measures is a difference between individuals on two sides of an income level. Either $1 million in adjusted gross income, 500,000 in adjusted gross income, that's the red line, or 200,000. Now, virtually all of the analysis here is based on our IRS data. All right? Now, I take the two groups, I take the groups above and below, I calculate a mean after-tax income per exemption. I'm going to tell you in a minute why I use exemptions. That's crucial. Then I take the two groups and use a complicated mathematical operation known as subtraction. And I get a difference. Now, here's why I use this. There are other measures. But this is, if we're going to talk about the gap between the rich and the poor, or in this case, the rich and the not so rich, why don't we look at the gap? Why don't we measure the gap? Instead of talking about the 99% and the 1%, let's just look at the size of the gap and see how it changes over time. No matter where I draw the line, what do you notice? That the line's lower on the right than it is on the left. That says the gap, adjusted for inflation, has gotten smaller from 1996, which is where the data starts, through 2009. Why, Ron, do you start in 1996? Because I'm using IRS data, it's data from brackets, and the data on exemptions per bracket go back to 1996. This is as far back as I could go using bracketed data. So I'm giving you all the data that I have. Some charts will go through 2009, but I can't use all of them through, some will go through 2010, most through 2009, and that's because for 2010, the exemption data is not yet available. Here is the essential message. Economic inequality, measured as the difference, has declined. You say, well, Ron, why aren't you talking like the Occupy Wall Street movement does? They look like they're having a lot of fun in a park, yelling about the 1% and the 99%. I could have constructed a chart here from the brackets that shows you the ratio of the fraction of after-tax income divided by the fraction of exemptions. That's kind of like the 1% and the 99%. If you use bracketed data, that's all you could get. If I did that for you, I will tell you right now that the results would have been more extreme than this chart. If I wanted to twist the argument, I would have used that measure because it declines much more than this does. If you look over time, the gap gets smaller. Now, you might say to me, why does it get smaller? This chart takes one of those lines on the previous one and shows you the means for the two. You know, the gap can get smaller because the lower incomes are decreasing less rapidly than the upper. All sorts of possibilities. This shows you the means for the two groups. Now you got to be careful. The blue line looks like it moves around more than the red line. That's because the scale for the blue line is on the right. The scale for the red line is on the left. On the right, 1 hash is $500. On the left, 1 hash is $5,000. So you can't judge relative movement necessarily from the chart. What do you know? The red line, which is for those above 200,000, declines over time in real terms. The blue line does what? Jumps all over the place. But the right number is higher than the leftmost number. The net trend is up. You'll read in the papers not only that economic inequality has increased, but somehow the wealthy danced through the recession while the poor suffered. Look at this chart. I'm not talking not necessarily the poor here, but I'm looking from 2007 to 2009. That's the data on the extreme right-hand part of the chart. The blue line declines by 4.7%. The red line declines by 26%. That the change in income, the reduction in income, was more severe for the upper income group than the lower income group. I know that sounds different to you, but that's what the data show. Now, you say, Ron, why do you do this per exemption? Why did you do it that way instead of per return? Let's talk about that a little. Let's talk about 3 measurement issues. Now, these can be a little bit tedious. I'll try to make it as interesting as possible, but it's very hard to develop jokes about these. First, I told you about one. The unit of measurement changes. Household size changes. This has an implication for tax return data, and I'm going to show you why. That means if you look at the data, you have to adjust for these changes. That's the reason I use exemptions, and I'm going to talk more about that. The surveys don't include all the income, and we're going to talk about the components of income for upper income returns. Finally, I'm going to talk to you about something you always wanted to know about, the Gini index. You said, I've never heard of it. That's an advantage. I'm going to tell you that it sounds really important, but it can be misleading, and it's part of my argument that says there are no perfect measures. I happen to think the best is the one I've showed you, the gap between the top and the bottom and what happens to it over time. We can understand that. We understand dollars. All right, here's some data that was released within the last month by the census. This is data on household income between 1967 and 2011. Now, I've switched here. This is the only screen that uses data other than IRS data. Now, the interesting thing is, and the census released the blue line. The blue line is mean household income unadjusted. I've already told you, household size has fallen over this period. The red line takes the blue line and divides it by mean household size. In other words, the measuring unit, a household. Incidentally, I don't know whether you're aware or not, the household is a collection of people with a single residence. It could be 3 buddies living together. It could be a family of 4. When you make the adjustments, you get a different trend. You can't see it perfectly from the chart, but you can notice that the blue line peaks in the late 90s, whereas the red line peaks later, and that the decline is attributable exclusively to the recession. The interesting thing is the compound annual growth rate of the blue line is 0.9% per year. The compound annual growth for the red line is about 1.5% per year. Now that sounds like a small number. That's the other problem with public discussion of inequality. It involves numbers that have very little, that do not resonate intuitively. The difference between 0.9 and 1.45 over 45 years is 28%. So if you publish this unadjusted, it grossly understates the extent to which economic welfare improved for households over this period. What does this have to do with IRS data? That's what I'm talking about. Ah, there's an interesting chart. This takes returns by bracket. The brackets go from 0 up to 1 million. I cap at 1 million. The top bracket is million above because I can use all the data for this. And I've got 3 years, 96, 2002, 2009. That's the full scope of my data. What do you notice? The blue line is above the red line and the green line between brackets starting around 25,000 up to about 100,000. Note, not much difference on the left, big difference in the middle, the famed middle class. That's the other error that's made in public discussion. People treat them as if they're classes. At one time, you were in the middle. You might not be in the middle now. And then, at the end, what do you notice? There's a difference. That 2009 is above 1996. The middle is the interesting part, though. There is a decline in the number of exemptions per return for brackets between 25 and 75,000 between 1996 and 2009. You got to adjust for that. That's why I'm using exemptions. You say, okay, explain that to me. Why do I have to adjust? Thank you. That's a good question. The red line is real mean after-tax income per return. Now, I'm looking only here at the brackets that have 25,000 at the bottom and 75,000 at the top. This is, roughly speaking, over the entire period I examined, about 37% of returns. It starts out at approximately 45% of total exemptions and falls to below 40% by the end of the period. The red line does what? Falls by, roughly speaking, 20%. What does the blue line do? Falls by less, about 9%. You say, well, wait a minute. It falls. Doesn't that mean the middle class is worse off? I want you to stop there. This is just how complicated it is. When you say that, you implicitly assume someone in this bracket in 1996 is identical to someone in this bracket in 2009. Over time, incomes go up. What does that suggest to you? The clear possibility that the group in this bracket in the later period is younger than the group in this bracket in the earlier period. That's important. I'm not going to give you another chart on this, but one of the constants of income dynamics is increases in earnings over one's lifetime. Older you are, unless you get so old as me, the more you earn. All right, let's look at the returns of millionaires. I'm done talking about changes in the characteristics of the unit. I'm going to switch now to income. The red line is the fraction of adjusted gross income that is either partnership income or S corporation income. What do you notice happens to that over this period? It increases from 1996 to 2009. Not monotonically, moves all over the place. We're going to come back and talk about that. The blue line is salary and wages. It's about 30% of adjusted gross income for returns above $1 million. That's substantially lower than the rest of the population. If you look below $1 million, about 75 to 80% of adjusted gross income comes from salary plus wages. Now, let's think about this. What do you suppose happens if you reduce personal income tax rates? Now there's an incentive to shift what would have been corporate income onto individual tax returns because it could be taxed less. So if you measured inequality using IRS data, and this is being done by wealthy individuals, and it is, you would measure an increase in inequality. Was there an increase in inequality? No, this income existed before. We just gave it a different name and put it on an individual return. Those are issues that rarely get discussed, but they complicate greatly any assessment of trends in inequality. Let's talk to our friend here, Mr. Ginny. Actually, his first name was Corrado, so if he's our friend, we'll call him by his first name. He was an Italian, and he was interested in income inequality, and he was looking at some analysis of an Italian who had looked at it previously, very famous Italian, Vilfredo Pareto. Started in Italy, he was trained as an engineer, couldn't get along with the faculty, so he went to Switzerland. Believe it or not, he found the Swiss easier to get along with. Now, what I've plotted here are what's called a Lorenz curve. Lorenz curve matches percent of population to percent of income. In my case, it's not population, it's percent of exemptions to percent of income. I've plotted it for 2 years, 2002 and 2007. You might well say, why did you pick those 2 years? So if you look at the Gini index over the period I examined, which I computed from the bracket data, those are the extremes after 2000. And the reason after 2000 is important is that the IRS changed the brackets between 1999 and 2000. And when you compute this from brackets, the computation is sensitive to the number of brackets you have. So these are the extremes. 2002 is the low, 2007 is the high. What does high and low mean? All right. You see I got 0, 0 on the bottom left and 1, 1 on the top right. And I have a thin blue line connecting it. So beneath that we have a triangle. It's kind of like a Fastnachtkuchen, one of these triangular pastries you get at Lent. All right, now let's suppose one of Obama's fat cats takes a bite out of this Fastnachtkuchen on the hypotenuse side. Okay? See the bite there? The bigger the bite, the greater is inequality. I bet you no one has ever told you the Gini index was like a Fastnachtkuchen. All right? 2002, by this measure, has less inequality than 2007. The closer you are to the line connecting to the diagonal line, the less inequality you have. Let's look at 2 points on the line. I've drawn a line, a blue line and a red line. The blue line is 2002. 51.7% of exemptions, about half of all exemptions, 25.5% of after-tax income. These Gini indexes always show less inequality, more equality if you use after-tax instead of pre-tax income. The mean income per exemption for that group in 2002 is $11,678. Now, let's go to 2007. What happens? The group gets more exemptions, correct? The fraction of income falls from 25.5 to 18.2. First reaction is they must be worse off. That's not the case. The mean income is $11,965. Now, both of those means are in 2007 dollars. This is the problem with the Gini index. It is an imperfect indicator of social welfare. Where would you rather be, 2002 or 2007? The 2 points I've chosen, you'd rather take 2007, even though there's more inequality. The Gini index is useful only if the size of the pie doesn't change. It will not give unambiguous signals about social welfare if the pie shifts. Okay? We're done with measurement. You have to pay attention to the measuring unit. You have to think about the sources of income. And you have to recognize no measure is perfect. Now, let's go back, because next slide, I promise you, is the most interesting one I have yet. I know your reaction is, that won't be hard. All right. Here's what I've done. If you took a course on managerial economics from me, I gave you a lecture explaining that the consumer price index over-adjusts for inflation. Don't worry, I'm not going to give you that lecture again. The problem is, the first chart where I looked at the difference between groups, I adjusted using the consumer price index. If the consumer price index overcompensates, that says the inclination is to make the earlier numbers bigger than they should be, which does what? Biases the comparison in favor of showing less inequality. That says, at the least, Ron, if you want to be honest, you ought to find another way to adjust this difference. This chart does this. I take the gap and I divide it by mean after-tax income per exemption, showing the fact that I taught in Australia for a while. I call that MATI. All right? The blue line. And again, we're looking here at returns above and below 500,000. That's kind of close to the 1% and the 99%. If you look over this period, at the end, it's about 0.7% of exemptions. Not too far off than the 1%. The blue line uses a mean for everybody. The red line, a mean for those with incomes under 200,000. The green line for AGI under 100,000. Again, the unit of observation is a return. Obviously, as you use a smaller mean, the curve shifts up. The blue's below the red, which is below the green. All three do what? They slope down to the right. They yield the same conclusion that the first chart did. There's no evidence of an increase in economic inequality. That's not the most interesting part of the chart. I want you to look at that chart carefully. You look at it for a while like it's a piece of modern art, and you say, it looks like it's becoming more of an M. This is a subliminal political advertisement for Romney. Why does it become more of an N? And what does it mean when it becomes more of an N? There's more variation, correct? It's moving up and down. Why is that happening? The answer is because the incomes of high-income earners are far more sensitive to swings in economic activity than the incomes of low-income earners. You don't read that in the paper. What do you read? The recession hit the poor hard. It may have. I don't want to say that it didn't, but it produced bigger swings in income for upper income groups than lower income groups. That's why the line becomes more of an M as you reduce the upper bound for the group I use to calculate the mean. Walk away from that, what do we say? We say if you adjust without using the CPI, you get the same conclusion. The gap between upper and lower income earners has not gotten bigger. Let me show you the same thing a little differently. Now that's an easy chart to read, right? This is the number of returns with AGI of at least 1 million. You know, you listen to the Occupy group long enough, talking about the 1% and the 99%, and you get the impression that these are permanent groups. That's not the case at all. Look at that swing. They go up, they go down. There was a massive decline. I shouldn't say. There was a large decline between 2007 and 2009 in the number of returns with AGI of at least $1 million. This is another way of making the point I made with the previous slide. Upper income return data is extremely sensitive to swings in economic activity. I mean, if I back up at this chart, I look at this and I tell the following story. We're a doctor. We're an economic doctor. Our patient is an economy. Patient comes in and we're looking at his or her EKG. I look at this and I say, I think you're healthy. Not because it slopes down, but isn't this what we expect in a capitalist economy? We expect people to make bets on new businesses. If you're betting on a new business, what do you want? A strong economy, better than a weak economy. You make those bets, you're going to get these swings right here. And if you had backed up to the slide where I talked about incomes above $1 million, how much came from S corporations, how much salary and wages, you would have noticed that's only about half, Ron. Where do you suppose the other half comes from? Dividends and capital gains. And they are large in good periods. What this is telling us is that if you make bets and they pay off, you get rich. We like that in a capitalist economy. But don't the rich avoid taxes? That's the other claim. They not only dance through the recession, but they don't pay their fair share. There's a very famous investor whose income is in the top group, no matter how I define it, who makes a lot of noise about this. I think this is the best measure of whether taxes are being shared correctly. What I've done here is taken the fraction of taxes paid and divided it by the fraction of adjusted gross income. All right? How big is the share of taxes a group pays relative to adjusted gross income? And I've calculated that for millionaires, people with an adjusted gross income of $1 million, and for 100,000 heirs. That's the blue line. What do you note over this period? It doesn't move much. That's not hard to conclude when you look at it. You say it bounces along there. What do you note? In good times, it's a little lower than in bad times. Nobody would believe you if you told them that. No one would believe that the wealthy pay a larger fraction of taxes in bad times than good times. But that is the case. If you look at the chart, look at 2000 and 2007, compare it to 2008 and other times. Now you notice that the data here go through 2010. That I was able to do because I don't need exemptions for this data. Well, let's change the debate. That's the last slide. And let's look at this slide again. Two ways to look at it. I've spent a lot of time talking about one. I want to talk about a second. The one I talked about, I said, is which way does it slope? Does it go up or does it go down? I told you it went down. I'm going to talk about it a different way. That gap is big. I'm not going to tell you it's too big because, as economists, we don't know how much inequality there should be. Whenever you hear an economist use the phrase too much inequality, you can conclude that he or she has moved outside his or her area of expertise. They have stopped being an economist and started being a moral philosopher, which we're all entitled to be. We don't know whether it's too big or too small, but at least we ought to ask, why is it big? When we look at it and see it's big, how do we come to that conclusion? Well, we look at the gap in the slide I showed you earlier. You know, the gap between millionaires and non-millionaires is about 750,000. It's a big number. It's a real big number. You say, well, isn't that big? We judge it relative to our income. I want to look at this differently. I want to start and ask, why is the number big? And let's treat this as if we were analyzing a business process. We have birth. What do you know about birth? Well, you could be lucky with a gene pool. There's a difference in talent that starts at birth. We could sit here for the rest of the day and argue about how much. Let's just agree that there's some we can't do anything about, but there is some we can do something about, and it's probably a significant portion. But that difference has something to do with economic outcomes. Now, what happens next? Well, you've got 6 years of care by your parents. We could also point out that the difference at birth, to some extent, is traceable to what the mother does during pregnancy. We can make that large or small depending on how much she takes care of herself. That's important, though. It's the first step, and it's going to go all the way through. If we want to make inequality smaller, we have to change the way we behave. The mother has to take care of herself during pregnancy. The parents have to take care or nurture that child. The school has to do its job, but the parents or somebody has to make sure that the child takes advantage of the education. Think back on your life. You were successful. You are where you are to some extent because on a number of occasions you did not what you wanted to do, but what someone told you you should do. You looked into the future and said, I don't want to do this, but I think there's a payoff to it. Or somebody is telling me there's a payoff to it. You made that decision, you weren't happy with it at the time, it looked a lot better later. On the other side, we can all tell these stories. You did something because you wanted to do it and didn't do something that you should have done. And you look back at that and say, I'm paying a price for that now. A significant part of what we're calling economic inequality is traceable to those kinds of decisions. Decisions by individuals to do what is fun as opposed to what makes you productive. We didn't do them because we wanted to. Often what happened? Someone encouraged us. Could have been a parent, could have been a teacher, could have been some organization we belonged to. Someone looked at us and said, in a convincing way, you know, I think you ought to behave differently. We didn't want to hear it. Sometimes it made us mad, but sometimes it got inside our head. Now, the question I want you to ask is, if we want to get less inequality, we have to have people making decisions that contribute to their productivity as opposed to decisions that make them very happy. How do we get that done? That's what should be the framework of the debate about economic inequality. What kinds of organizations are likely to be the most successful at nurturing the kinds of habits that contribute to economic success? Do we want the government to do this? Or do we want not-for-profit organizations to do this? If it's the government that does this, do we want it to be the federal government, which will have a one-size-fits-all policy from coast to coast? Or do we want it done by state and local governments? Now, I get a federal edict now that tells me that if a student comes to the university with disabilities, they must have 1.5 as much time as I give other students to take the exam. I've called the people who say this. I said, but they're allowed to take notes to class. Doesn't make any difference. We have a rule, we have a federal test-taking procedure. I want you to ask, does it make sense to have single rules if our objective is to get people to think carefully at these crucial moments in their life about doing something for now as opposed to something for the future? Now, let's admit something else. We don't know how to do this. It's not clear how to do this. We know ways to try, but it's not clear that the program is better at the federal, as a government program, or as the Boy Scouts, or somebody else. We don't know how to do this, and when you don't know how to do something, what's the best way to proceed? Let's try a lot of different things and see what works. If some work, what should we do? Copy it. Some work, some don't work, what should we do? Get rid of them. If we have not-for-profit, non-government organizations doing this, and they do something that doesn't work, what will happen? They'll have trouble raising money. If they do something that works, what will happen? They'll have less trouble raising money. This suggests to me that the debate or the argument, which is advocated by both presidential candidates, to get rid of the deduction for charities is not a sensible policy. That we ought to be thinking about encouraging the funding of these new ventures that have as their purpose, loosely speaking, building character, getting the people to think about the long-term consequences of what they do now. I wish that were the debate. It's not. It's a debate about fat cats or skinny cats or whatever. We should be wondering what kind of organizations will best shape individuals so that they get the most from their potential. And if we do that, economic inequality will be smaller than the measures that I gave you. I'm ready to take any questions you have. Okay. No, I'm certain it's on a return. That doesn't mean it gets to the IRS tables that I see. And the second point there, and in defense of the IRS, they have a problem, and that is they don't want to disclose private information. So when they think about a group, they want the group to be large enough that you can't figure out who's in it. Now, if you go through, there is a report called The Sources of Income, which I have looked at in detail. And I haven't found a category for tax exempt. You can find a difference between total income and taxable income. That's not a big number in the tables that I've looked at. It's a good question, and I don't know to what extent the results are biased by that. There are 140 million returns in 2009. I'm remembering the last number. Only 250,000 had AGI above 1 million. So if they're not common. I mean, 250,000 is not a small number, but that's a small fraction of the total. Let me answer your question directly. The Federal Reserve has data on wealth. I have not looked at it yet. That's an interesting question. Nonetheless, you would find wealth and income to be correlated. Warren Buffett's income is large, not because he draws a large salary from Berkshire Hathaway. His salary is only $100,000. It comes from the assets that he has. In addition to which, I will share with you, there is some evidence that the wealth disparity has gotten bigger recently because, think through, lower income individuals have a larger fraction of their wealth in housing than upper income individuals, and this hasn't been good for housing over the last 3 years. So that those assets have declined, and so the wealth disparity got bigger. I haven't looked at the numbers yet, but I anticipate to find complicated measurement problems I have here. The ratio has gone up over time. I get to use a technology that I'm more familiar with. If you look at it, put some lights on. There. This doesn't tell the full story. Up to about 1992, the ratio drifts up slowly. This is CEO pay to pay for the average worker. And if you send me an email afterwards, I'll send you a picture of the chart. Okay? After 1992, it goes up, but it starts to move all over the place. Why do you think that happened? Congress passed a law that said salary, as deductible for tax purposes, is capped at $1 million. There is no cap on pay that's performance-based. Options are performance-based. What happened? Everybody started to get paid in options. So you have these enormous swings in the ratio afterwards. The data that I've seen, I'm trying to go through this on my own to corroborate it, however, are that it's not CEO pay that's inflating upper income. And in fact, I like crazy ideas. Here's a crazy one I'm exploring. It may prove to be crazy. If you look at the longer time series, inequality increases about the same time that state lotteries get big. And I'm trying to find a way to calculate what fraction of incomes above $1 million annually are attributable to lottery winnings. You can't find, you're scratching your head and say, that can't be it. I'm not convinced yet. I may come to that conclusion. But it's, when you start going through and reading about these, I've read about all sorts of people and how they got rich and what they did, and fascinating stories. Trying to compile this from individual stories, I think it's a big number. Now, I'm looking for a better way to collect that. If you, it's the S corporation data in the upper incomes is not coming from conventional businesses. If you look at business income, it's about 7% of the income from S corporations for people with an AGI of at least $1 million. And that those S corporations can be hedge funds or whatever that are, and the money's coming there. Typically, if you're a CEO, you probably are saying to yourself, I'd have made a lot more money if I went to work for a hedge fund. Often, CEOs leave and go to work for private equity firms and make more money. I don't think it's CEO pay. It could be NBA salaries or all sorts of things. Yeah, it's always troubling to imagine what will happen when Congress starts thinking about this. The principles are pretty straightforward. You want rates low. You want to eliminate deductions. And you want to get rid of corporate taxes. And if you get rid of corporate taxes, you can tax dividends at the same rate as you tax ordinary income. Whether that'll come out, I'm doubtful that'll come out of Congress. There are all sorts of groups that will get very excited once Congress starts looking at tax laws. I mean, economists have been arguing for this for a long time. There have been elected representatives who make this noise for a long time, and there has been no impact. I don't know what will happen. And, the one that really is important and significant, and I think favors upper income groups, is the mortgage deduction. And furthermore, it's never discussed, but I cycle a lot. I ride through all sorts of places, can't help but look at the size of the houses. And you ask yourself, would they have built that house at that size if there hadn't been a mortgage deduction? And I think the answer is no. Now, take that a little further. How much of greenhouse gases are going into the air as a result of having to heat that place? But I don't know what's going to happen. And it probably won't depend on who gets elected. You might build a smaller house and put other stuff in it. If you reduce the rates and eliminate the deduction, you can do this so that it's neutral with respect to income individuals have. That doesn't mean, it is probably true they will choose to spend it on something other than housing, and it won't be good for the housing industry. MIT's 47%. It's a large number, but it varies from year to year. It's hard to get that out of the IRS data. Only about 32 million of 140 million itemized. And the data, I'm trying to remember because I have a table, it's on my computer, and I'm relying on my memory here. The number of returns using the earned income tax credit is much less than 47%, although in some years it's as high as 20%. And they're not paying any income tax. The difference between taxable returns and non-taxable, and total returns, which I can get from my data, is not going to get you down to 47%. The assumption is, that is a problem. And the tax laws would have to deal with that. But the corporate income tax is a tax on you and me. It's a myth to think there are this entity out there called corporations that are paying it and we don't have to pay it. We are paying it in the prices of what we buy. And so there's not a cookie jar called corporations that we can reach into and get some money from time to time. The issue of whether an individual could, and you can deal with that with some kind of minimal amount of income. You could say zero above a certain level. I don't know, but you raise an interesting point. The changes in the IRS returns. Now, you got to be careful when you look at the IRS data, and you have to find a data source that gives you number of exemptions, not dollar amount of the exemptions. Because, and I found that. But the data seem to behave as I would expect them to behave, given what's happened to mean household size in census data. I got into this because I was trying to understand why people were interested in CEO pay. And now I'm looking at the prospect of finding something else to look at, which Chris gave me a suggestion, or becoming a tax expert. The second terrifies me. Some of the proposals call for getting rid of the payroll tax, which makes a lot of sense. It's a tax on hiring. These taxes have a lot to do with the number of people you hire, as well as, and that's impacted by the Fair Labor Standards Act, which requires overtime payment, and the rules for holidays, et cetera. All of those things impact the number of people you hire, and making it advantageous to have more people work longer. Now there is a movement to part-time, but that has to do with benefits. That's an interesting question. I'd have to go to a different source to get that. You can get CEO compensation data, that's compiled. You need mean compensation for other people in the firm. It would be interesting to measure that gap.
But I think there's data that shows that the average CEO pay is lower quicker right now.
It's gone up. The ratio has gone up. The ratio can go up over time without the gap moving the same way. Depends on how much the bottom and the top. The gap, however, probably has gone up. Okay, I want to take pause here. There's a lot of noise made about this business of the ratio of the CEO's pay to the pay of the average worker. And that when that goes up, there's something wrong. I want to get that idea out of your head. That number we don't know how that number should behave. If the CEO's job gets a lot more complicated than the average worker's job, the ratio ought to go up, and the gap ought to go up. Now think about this. Go back 40 years, or 50 years. CEO of a public traded company, quite likely, was operating in one country, in a much different regulatory environment. It was a less complicated job. Now that individual is operating in several countries. It's good because we have trade now. If they're operating in the taxpayer's interest, they should try to shift profits to the countries where the corporate tax rates are lowest. If the CEO does that, he or she's condemned. And it's a lot tougher job now than it was 40 years ago. And I would not make the argument that the job of the typical worker is necessarily a lot tougher now, in the same way. I've gone to the IRS site frequently and started to read some of these parts of the tax law. On the nights that I have difficulty sleeping, that's a good exercise because I'm suddenly asleep in front of my computer. I don't know. And there's a bunch of questions like this that have been puzzling me. I think I have to track down a tax expert. Well, most of the proposals I've seen for getting rid of the corporate tax, reducing the individual income tax rates, have been accompanied with proposals for a value-added tax. Now, if those individuals with larger incomes are doing the spending, they're going to pay it that way. I'm simply going to say I'm not a tax expert. The only thing I will argue is that anybody who has told you that income inequality has grown has not looked at the data carefully. No. And it exists. You can get the state data you can get the IRS data by state. I don't know that I can get it in the same detail that I've examined it to do this. I've looked at the reports and they are far briefer than the, say, source of income reports that are available. If you look at average tax rates and look at individual brackets, and I will tell you, if you look at the average tax rates are lower for the upper income brackets. But if you look at the fraction of tax paid, it has not changed over time. I mean, you have to understand that the fraction of tax paid depends upon the base, what happens to the income, So the total taxes can go up even though the marginal rates are lower. What's happened, if you, my slide showing income of individuals with AGI at least $1 million. One of the reasons you notice the big jump, and I look at after tax to show the jump, is a larger fraction of income in good years comes from capital gains and dividends, which are taxed at lower rates than ordinary income. Okay, but I'm looking at IRS data by brackets, okay? And I'm looking at total tax paid as a fraction of adjusted gross income, not as a fraction of taxable income. And that's the number and that's what I'm calling the average tax rate. And that goes up as brackets go up until I think it's around the $2 to $5 million category, and then it goes down a little. And that's because a much larger fraction of income for the top groups takes the form of income that is taxed at lower rates.